The EVO Comp alloy suspension is made up of a Fox Float X performance rear shock and a Fox Float 36 rhythm fork. In this video we're reviewing the adjustability of the fork, but note it's important to dial in the rear suspension before adjusting the front, so be sure to check out our previous video which covers the rear shock. In our video overview of the rear shock, we covered the Specialized Suspension Calculator web tool. It is an insightful tool but does not include the 2022 EVO models or riders under £100. But let's take a look at the recommendations for the 2021 EVO Comp, which shares the same Fox 36 rhythm fork as the 2022 EVO Comp and Comp alloy. We input a range of rider weights into the suspension calculator and summarize the results in this chart. You can see the tool doesn't provide meaningful recommendations for riders under £100. This isn't very helpful for Millie, who weighs around 85 pounds with her gear on. It would be great if Specialized could update the site for 2022 EVO models and add recommendations for lighter riders. So now let's take a look at the adjustability of the fork, which is similar to the Fox Float 36 Performance Elite included with the more expensive EVO Expert build. The Performance Elite fork has the Grip 2 damper rather than the Grip damper, so it has separately adjustable high-speed compression damping and high-speed rebound damping not found on the EVO Comp builds. The Performance Elite has some other improvements over the Rhythm fork, but based on reviews of the 2022 EVO Comp bikes I've watched, the reviewers don't complain about these missing features. The fork is air sprung, so you can adjust the pressure to dial in sag. It also has adjustable low-speed rebound and a 2-position sweep low-speed compression lever. Also, volume spacers can be added or removed from the fork. We will take a more in-depth look at what each of these adjustments do. Getting sag right is the most important aspect of setting up your suspension, so we'll discuss that first. Sag is the amount of travel used by the weight of the rider and their gear when the rider is stationary on the bike with both feet off the ground. This should be measured in the rider's regular riding position for best results. For a cross-country rider, this will likely be in a seated position, and for a more downhill-focused rider, it will be in the rider's neutral standing position. Having some degree of sag means the suspension's neutral state is partly compressed, allowing for both up and down movements to smooth out bumps and dips, improving traction control and comfort. Having too much sag, the suspension will bottom out frequently when hitting obstacles. If you set too little sag, you won't use the full range of travel. Fox recommends sag of between 15 and 20% of the travel of the fork as a base setting. For the S2 to S6 sizes, the total travel is 160mm, giving a sag of between 24 and 32mm. The S1 size has 150mm of travel, resulting in a sag of between 22 and 30mm. The chart above is Fox's recommended fork pressure for various rider weights. It differs slightly from the Specialized Suspension Calculator we mentioned earlier, but both sources are fairly close and may simply reflect a difference in the optimal recommended sag. Fox also notes suggested pressures on the back of the fork for easy reference. Like many modern forks, volume reducers can be added or removed from the fork to decrease or increase the volume of the air in the air spring. Let's take a closer look at how that works. The graph here shows travel on the horizontal axis and spring force on the vertical axis for a shock with a medium spacer. As the shock moves further through its travel, the spring force gets increasingly higher. This is a progressive setup as the increase in spring force increases at a faster rate than the travel. Heavier riders may need more spring force deep into the travel to prevent bottom outs, which can be achieved by adding larger spacers to decrease the air volume in the shock. This causes the pressure in the suspension to increase more rapidly as the shock moves deeper into its travel. This is a more progressive setup. Conversely, if you're not able to use the whole travel, removing spacers could help as the spring force does not ramp up as much towards the end of travel. This would be a more linear setup. Fox mentions the fork comes standard with 2 spacers installed. It's likely Millie won't be able to use the whole travel of the fork due to her light weight. If that's the case, then we may well remove spacers. Now let's move on to rebound damping. So what exactly is rebound damping? After the force compressing the suspension is removed, the air spring will force or rebound the suspension back to its initial position. Adding rebound damping slows the rebound. We want to set up our rebound to maximize traction. If rebound is too fast, the suspension will bounce off obstacles and break traction. If it is too slow, the suspension won't return to its full length and will get packed down, reducing the amount of available travel. On the Fox 36 forks, turning the rebound damping dial clockwise adds more damping. As an initial starting point, Fox recommends setting the rebound damping clicks from fully closed to the corresponding rider weight in the chart shown here. Millie weighs 85 pounds in her riding gear, so we're going to set Rebound Damping at 13 clicks for now. As Millie gets more time on the bike, we'll make some additional tweaks to further dial in the rebound damping. Before we take a look at low-speed compression damping, it's important to set sag and rebound first. For the most part, sag and rebound settings are set and forget, whereas rebound damping is terrain-specific and is largely down to personal preference. Compression damping impacts the speed at which the suspension moves through its travel. More compression damping will slow the movement of the suspension through its travel when a force compresses the fork. Less damping will allow the suspension to react more quickly to that force. On the Rhythm 36, the compression damping adjustment lever is essentially continuously variable from wide open to firm. Wide open is zero damping, while the firm position is the most damped. The Rhythm 36 has the grip damper, which doesn't have any clicks, so it is harder to consistently dial in a specific damping level compared to, say, the Grip 2 damper. I spent some time on the SRAM website, which explains how to set rebound damping in layman's terms better than most sources. But let's break it down into open, medium and firm settings. Essentially, the wide open setting is for downhill or tech trails where you need responsive suspension to absorb the choppy terrain. A medium setting would be for dips and corners on flow trails or jumps where you don't want the suspension to rapidly dive, which would unsettle the bike and blow through travel. Some compression damping helps to keep the bike more poppy while maintaining momentum. A fully closed position would be for non-technical climbs where losing traction isn't much of a factor. This is typically less of an issue for the fork than for the shock, where pedal bob can be significant. With that said, setting compression damping is highly rider and terrain specific, so these guidelines are just a starting point for a rider. For Millie, we will initially add a small amount of compression damping to prevent the fork diving too much when hitting a drop, which has the tendency to pitch the rider forward and off the bike. Now we've reviewed the functionality of the fork, let's go over the steps involved in setting it up. First off, you have to wear your appropriate riding gear.
Why?
So the sag reflects your total weight when riding the bike. Next, we're pushing the seat all the way down as it moves your body weight slightly further forward to better approximate a trail riding position. Now turn the rebound dial in the anti-clockwise direction until it is in the fully open position. Next up, rotate the compression damping lever anti-clockwise to fully open. If you haven't set the sag before, it's a good idea to pump the fork PSI to around half of your body weight in pounds as a starting point. This is a good approximation of your required pressure, making subsequent adjustments smaller and more precise. So go ahead and remove the valve cap and attach the shock pump. Pump to your required pressure. If there is too much pressure, press the bleed valve on the pump to let some air out. As we get close to our required pressure, we need to equalize the air chambers in the fork, so cycle the fork through 25% of its travel a handful of times. If it hasn't been used for a while, cycling through the travel will also unstick the fork, which makes dialing in sag easier. Now it's time for Millie to get on the bike and sit on the saddle with her feet on the pedals. This causes the suspension to sag. Next up, push the O-ring up against the seal. We picked up a great tip from a Clint Gibbs video. Flipping the two-position lever to its firm setting will help reduce unwanted movement of the O-ring when getting off the bike. Now make sure to get off the bike without bouncing. This should be relatively straightforward with the low saddle height. Now it's time to measure the sag. It can be difficult to measure the sag from the O-ring to the seal with a measure or a micrometer, so we made a simple tool to better measure the sag. This was another great tip from Clint Gibbs. We cut down an old plastic card to roughly the required sag. We chose 28mm as a starting point, as it is the midpoint of Fox's recommended sag range of 15 to 20%. Pull up on the fork stanchion or crown to fully extend the fork. Take the cut down card and insert it between the O-ring and the fork seal. If the card is smaller than the gap, you'll need to let out some air, and if it's larger than the gap, you will have to add some air. If you've added or removed a significant amount of air, you will likely have to repeat the whole process to reevaluate whether your sag is now set correctly. We ended up setting Millie's fork pressure to 40 psi. The next step is to set the rebound damping. Millie weighs 85 pounds in her riding gear, so we're going to set rebound damping at 13 clicks for now. And now finally, we'll dial in a small amount of compression damping to prevent the fork diving too much when hitting drops. We'll make adjustments to this setting as Millie gets more time on the bike and as the terrain she rides changes. So that's it. We have a baseline for Millie's suspension settings that we can tweak as she gets more experience on her bike and as her riding style evolves.
Thank you for watching Dizi Does Downhill. Make sure to subscribe, put some comments down below, and like it.